Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Gill. Welcome.
My guest today is Dr. Ian Williams, trained as a biochemist at the universities of Bristol and Oxford, and headed molecular sciences at Pfizer for 20 years. Later, he took an MFA from Bennington College in Vermont. He and his wife, Nancy Hudson, have a farm in Connecticut containing over 50 large-scale sculptures that Ian has made over the last decade. Together with Nancy, he has ridden in horseback safaris in many parts of the world. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Gill. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So, as I mentioned, we don't really have a set agenda for this conversation, so we can take it wherever you would like to take it. But I would like to start. You recently published a book, and it's entitled A Brid's Bestiary. I wondered if we can start there, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the motivation behind the book and perhaps some of the contents.
Sure, I'd be happy to. As you mentioned, about 10 years ago, I took an MFA in writing from Bennington College in Vermont, and that was a culmination of an interest I've had for a long time in writing, which I find a very good way to organize one's thoughts and indeed even to find out what you're actually thinking by putting it down on paper. I almost invariably write nonfiction, and I did publish a book probably 15 years ago about my horseback riding experiences in Africa. In any event, I've written a number of articles for various magazines, and I've always enjoyed that.
Yeah.
And I had this idea probably in November of last year of writing this book, which is, as you mentioned, its title is a bestiary. And a bestiary is a medieval concept when people would write books about animals that they had heard of from travelers going to various parts of the world.
Yeah.
And they would come up with these descriptions of rhinos or something like that, which were often bore little resemblance to what we think of as a rhino, but they sold lots of copies. People were always very interested to find out what strange animals were in other lands. And so the whole idea appealed to me. And as I looked into that idea, a number of people have written bestiaries, and some quite recently. And I thought, well, that would be a fun thing to do, because I've been around the world on horseback and seen lots of different animals. And so I thought, yeah, I'll give that a shot.
Yeah, and it's organized with kind of descriptions of your experiences or your interactions with different animals.
Yes.
In alphabets, A for alligator is sort of the first chapter there, right?
Right.
And so I remember your previous book, when you were in Africa, there was there was sort of a difficult situation, right? I don't know, sort of almost like a life-threatening situation in Africa. I don't know if I remember that
Yeah,
correctly. Yeah.
yeah. In fact, that's really what put me on the road to getting my MFA. This happened in 2004 when I was 50, and we were out riding in Africa and Kenya as it happened, and I contracted very severe pneumonia. And that's not something you want to do when you're out in the bush. Anyway, I went to a local hospital, and they called the flying doctor.
Yeah.
And so I was flown to Nairobi, and I spent a couple of weeks in hospital, half the time in intensive care there. So it was a very touch and go thing. And that kind of experience is really quite salutary. And I think having recovered from it, very fortunate, because it causes you to focus what's important in your life, what are you doing, what are you really enjoying.
Right.
So when I came back to the States, that was when I decided, I've had a good run in pharmaceuticals, working with Pfizer, which was a great company, and I learned a great deal and had a fine time. But I thought, well, I'm still relatively young. I stopped that. Unfortunately, I had enough money to be able to do that. And then I really started my life as an artist, doing sculptures, paintings, large and small sculptures. And that's what really set me on that trail.
Yeah. Did you have any training in that, or you just
No,
picked it up? Yeah.
not at all. And I think, I and I don't know if this was true with your experience growing up in India, but growing up in England when I did in the 60s, if you were if you could, had a couple of marbles to rub together, they immediately pushed you into sciences because they thought this was the way of the future. This was the 60s, right? The future is in plastics, right?
Yeah.
So I took science from a very early age. And I probably, had I been a little more self-aware or self-confident when I was 14 or so, I may have gone more to the arts because I enjoyed them. I had a pretty good proclivity to languages. I always enjoyed English literature, but that just didn't work out. And so I think there's been fomenting there for many years this unrealized ambition.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, my close call, as it were, in Africa freed me up, if you like, to be able to pursue that.
Right. Right. Yeah. I can definitely relate to that. And so I sometimes, describe to people, if you didn't have a constraint in terms of education when I was growing up in India, it's a bit like, behind door number one is medicine, behind door number two is engineering, and you never want to open door number three.
Exactly right. That's exactly right.
And I had a sort of a similar journey like you. My dad is a professor of engineering. I went into engineering in that binary choice that was presented to me, but realized that I never really liked engineering that much. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think in the U.S., the flexibility in that dimension appears to be lot higher, right, compared to
Yeah.
England or India. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. And as we both know, um, the undergraduate opportunities here, or what people typically do for an undergraduate degree, is often much, much broader than the specialization that we both went through. And I think that then gives you time to mature so that when you're in your early 20s
Right.
and if you want to stay in an academic career, you then can choose your discipline, puts you in a much better state than doing it at 14, which is essentially what happened to us.
Yeah.
Although I think it's important to say, and I certainly I speak for myself, um, that it was a very good. I mean, I enjoyed science, it has stood me in very good stead. And I think in the current world where science is being pushed to the side and emotions are playing a ever bigger part in making really quite important decisions,
Mhm.
it's good to have that scientific background because it grounds you you have a rational thought process, even though that may not manifest itself very often in economics. At least there is an opportunity. You can really try to be objective about situations which you face or that you see in the outside world. And then finally, it afforded me a very good income and allowed me to do lots of things that had I become an artist, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the breadth of experiences that you have is good in one dimension, but as areas get more and more specialized, to actually make a contribution, you really have to dive deeper and deeper, right? Because there is only so much you can actually actually learn in a broad perspective, because you just don't have the time if you want to go deeper. So
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did.
No. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, you're right. I mean, it's back to the metaphor of the fox and the hedgehog, as you either are more of a dilettante, dabbling in lots of many different fields, or you just focus on one thing, like the hedgehog can roll up into a ball and protect itself. I think there are clear benefits in both, and I'm not sure that you need people who are able to work, if indeed this is the case, on both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah.
So, for example, as we well know, if somebody becomes highly specialized in order to be competitive in a scientific field, let us say, that is essential to make progress, because a lot of things are so complex now, you have no time to look at other things. On the other hand, if you have a reasonable understanding across a broad area, then it's like you can recognize emergent phenomena, you can recognize where to apply pressure, resources, investment that somebody who is much more specialized cannot see.
Right.
And one of the great examples which impacted on my life fairly early on is that when I started my career in biochemistry, I became very interested in what's called intermediary metabolism. How does the body select, metabolize, use, and store all the different fuels, protein, fat, carbohydrate?
Yeah.
And as you get more and more specialized in understanding the molecular biology of different cell types in fuel selection, you lose the bigger picture of what the animal is trying to do to survive starvation or a hormonal change or stress. So you need to be able to operate at both ends, if you like, if indeed is an end of this spectrum. Yeah. So I wouldn't cause it, not that you're necessarily suggesting that, but I wouldn't say that it's a loss or a detriment. I think that you need both.
Yeah. So from a Western medicine perspective, I think, we seem to be more mechanistic. We seem to be more, component by component, analytics. Whereas the concept of Eastern medicine, for example, is more holistic, and that's a term that most scientists don't like because it doesn't really mean anything. But it's a different perspective. So, I want to get your thoughts on this. Pharmaceuticals and medicine in general, we seem to have hit a plateau. We're not seeing a lot of extension in life, and more importantly, we are not seeing utility enhance your happy life extension, right? We have a lot of medications. Much of them are delivering very, very incremental benefits to humans, and so I wonder, are we reaching a point where this mechanistic view of the body, keeping it alive a little bit longer, is really a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think of myself as adopting a middle way here. I have read and thought a fair bit about what, let's call, for a shorthand, more Eastern traditions of medicine, as you put it, holistic, considering the whole person, the energy of that person, whether one believes in chakras and things like that, or whether it's more of treating the overall psychology of the person that walks in the door. And I feel that that is exceptionally important. Equally well, if somebody walks in with a mutation in some gene leading to a cancer, you better have the molecular knowledge and therapeutics to be able to target that as precisely as possible
Right.
to save them. And those are sort of obvious points. But it's that middle ground of knowing when to go and which way to go. I have a good friend who is a GP, and he's in his early 70s, but he is without doubt one of the best GPs I know because he has so much experience and he can almost read somebody when they walk through the door and can assess with a few questions a lot of the things that are troubling them, often psychologically, which then manifest themselves physiologically.
Right.
And I think that's really critical. To your point about, I do feel that Western pharmaceutical medicine has running into a sort of an asymptote of potential efficacy here. The
Yeah.
untreated diseases such as Alzheimer's, chronic diseases like arthritis, type 2 diabetes are being treated to some extent, but far from adequately. And I feel that we have pretty much exhausted a lot of the molecular basis for other things. Here's one thought I might have to add to this conversation,
Yeah.
and that is, as you well know, when someone walks in the door, it's not the percentage of human cells that walks through the door is pretty small. 99% of it is bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And
Right.
just now, as you're only too well aware, and I suspect our listeners are, we're beginning to appreciate that from understanding or thinking about the metabiome in the gut and its influence throughout the body, which is really quite profound. So I think that is an important new therapeutic avenue to explore,
Yeah.
which will have enormous implications in a lot of what we traditionally think of as being fairly refractory and difficult chronic diseases, atherosclerosis, depression, osteoarthritis. A lot of these things, I think, will have their etiology and their pathophysiology based upon bacterial imbalances brought about by Western diet or any diet for that matter that is not what our genome evolved eating,
Yeah.
and further complicated by our lifestyles and the way in which we treat the whole nutrition aspect of our life, which is really pretty bad when one thinks about it. So I
Yeah.
think into your point, I think that may encompass elements of both Western and Eastern traditions.
Yeah.
Western in terms of understanding what bacteria are abnormal in a particular individual and why is that and how could we treat that, and then Eastern in the sense of how is that affecting the person's psyche, their overall energy, their overall day-to-day feelings. And so maybe that's a way of giving a little more, what could I say, scientific grounding for the skeptics
Right.
and an avenue to explore.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other dimension here is, of course, the connection between behavioral health and physical health, which, again, in our system, we have differentiated, in a very hard way, right? So behavioral health, both from a payer perspective as well as from a provider perspective, is treated distinctly different from physical health. And, if you go back to the microbiome idea, I remember reading something about there are some nerve endings in the gut that apparently the microbiome could manipulate to even change your mental state.
Oh yes, that's pretty well established. Yeah, it
Okay.
affects the vagal nerve, which is the major nerve which innervates the gut, and there is there are data to suggest that it could cause depression, could change one's dietary proclivity, which is an interesting thought. And indeed, there may be, and this is getting a bit far-reaching now, but you could think almost of the metabiome controlling the human to try and achieve certain goals.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you could think of the human as sort of an enclosure.
Yeah.
A necessary enclosure for the
Yeah,
metabiome.
exactly. It's the robot. Well,
Right.
perhaps we've gone a little too far on this, but who knows?
I mean, it's sort of too surprising in the sense that, the bacteria has been here for 4 billion years.
Yes.
And we showed up just 300,000 years ago. So,
yeah.
And more from, if you look at all the metrics, the bacteria is much more successful organism from any measure.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's
right?
the thing that just crossed my mind as you were talking. There's a great example of a bacterium which will colonize ants, and then the bacteria enter the ant's brain and change the ant's behavior such that it will climb trees and go out onto branches, the distal end of branches, where the ant then dies, falls off the branch, and the bacteria therefore extends its territory.
Wow.
I mean, it's really remarkable stuff, right? And of course, as you say, that just happens because of I don't know how long ants have been around, maybe 2 billion, but 2 billion years of trial and error and selection pressures that confer that behavior. But
so that is really difficult to understand. So, when we think about intelligence, we think about planning, strategy, leading to an action. A single cell organism or a collection of single cell organisms being able to plan and execute a very complex strategy in that case, right, is sort of inexplicable from our definitions of how a complex organism like the human being actually gains intelligence.
Yeah, well, I think one has to be careful not to anthropomorphize this and careful of the words one uses. It's not intelligence. I mean, so you go back 2 billion years, a bacterium happens to get into an ant's brain, and this causes this behavior in the ant. Okay, some neurons are destroyed, and for whatever reason, it decides to climb trees, and that then confers a selective advantage on that bacterium because it gets to new territory, new sources of food, it can colonize more things and grow. And it's that causes its success. It's not like the bacteria decides one day, well, how can I get farther away? Because there's no food here, And I think that's an important thing to think about. And it's the sort of hive mentality. I mean, if you look at the complexities of a termite mound or a beehive, there are many, or even indeed our own cities, where you get emergent phenomena arising that aren't planned per se. Even with our great sort of planning and so-called logical, in some sense, reasoning, a lot of our collective behaviors emanate from no rational causes. There's something else that happens there. And I think I mean, you know much more about this than me, Gill, and maybe you could opine on that. But perhaps when we have parallel quantum computing, then these things will evolve, and perhaps artificial intelligence will be sort of evolve. It will self-select, and hopefully at such a fast rate that it can do it in real time as opposed to billions of years, just by virtue of having so much capacity. Is that fair?
So in computing now, there's kind of 3 different directions. One is the conventional chip that the Moore's law, that we expected the speed to double every 18 months or so. That is plateauing. That's going to fail in a few years. When we get the channels down to 4 nanometers or so, and then you get quantum tunneling and variety of other, kind of fundamental physics-related constraints that you can go any further. Then you have quantum computing, which is a challenge in itself in qubits, getting them to to stay and do work. But more interestingly to me, and this is something that I know that you have thought about too, which is there's a deficiency in computing today, and that is we have to keep data and processing separate. And that takes a lot of energy, that takes a lot of, it creates a lot of complications from a computing perspective. Whereas if you look at the brain, and I look for your thoughts on this, we have essentially computing or processing happening co-located with memory, right? So the neurons and the synapses are essentially co-located, and so you don't have a data transport energy problem. um, and so the brain is so efficient, in terms of energy use, being able to do so many things. So that's the direction it looks like computing could go, to make computers more interesting. But what is missing there, is really a theory of consciousness, right? So,
Yes, right,
and so without a handle on how does consciousness emerge,
right.
we won't be able to go much further than getting, we can get a very efficient machine that uses much less energy and does all of these things that the brain apparently is doing, but it's not going to be intelligent the way that we think of it, because we just don't know how consciousness emerges.
Yeah, well, I think it's been a source of human endeavor since the very dawn of civilization to try and understand consciousness. And I doubt whether we're going to offer any great insights now. However, I wonder if there's really a distinction between consciousness and intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think one must be clear on that. Consciousness being a self-awareness, a sensory perception that there is something inside me, having this conversation, having these thoughts. There is something that is me, and all my associated history. And as to whether a machine can ever achieve that, I don't know. It feels to me like it's probably an emergent property, and one that is not readily understandable from a perspective of disaggregating, that we will ever really be able to say what consciousness is. It's the result of this neuronal activity and this neuronal activity, and you integrate those together and you have self-awareness. And I come back to my earlier analogy of emergent behavior in cities, for example.
Yeah.
Why does this particular area develop into a Chinatown, or that particular area into a financial center? Well, you can go back and say, well, a bank moved there, or some wealthy Chinese fellow opened a couple of restaurants and it grew from there, possibly. But there are probably other things that we just can't know, but they emanate up from a collection of thousands, if not millions, of different human behaviors that
Right.
then emerge, right? So maybe that's how consciousness comes, and maybe that could emerge in machines, given enough parallel processing capacity and memory.
Right.
But intelligence, I mean, then it's a utility question, really. Perhaps it's a misuse of the word intelligence, but I talk to Siri all the time, and
Yeah.
she helps me out enormously. Now it's pretty much all fact based. No, I think it is.
Right.
But I think a lot of people 3 decades ago would say that's a pretty intelligent machine you have there. So it's, what is your definition of machine intelligence? I think that's an important thing
Yeah.
to really, nail down if we're going to talk about the evolution of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. It is. It's a really difficult thing because a lot of people have different. Everybody has a different definition,
Yeah.
even for artificial intelligence, let alone intelligence. So, intelligence, in my view, and I haven't thought deeply about this. In my view, is the ability to take an unknown problem So you have no history. You really have so ironically, when we think about machine learning, for example, which is a fancy term for statistical modeling, it's fundamentally driven by historical data, right? And so in that context, I always argued that machines are not learning anything at all. We're just putting some models together, and we have been doing that for 100 years or more. There isn't really anything there that is leading to intelligence. In that context, intelligence for me is something that takes an unknown problem without any history and able to solve it.
Well, let me challenge that, Gil, because
Yeah, yeah.
as I think about the evolution of human intelligence within an individual, all right, so you're conceived, and cells start to divide in your fetal form, and eventually a CNS system develops. And so you ask yourself, well, what is that brain experiencing? Well, it's probably experiencing, one of the first things it experiences is smell and taste. It's being perfused with fetal fluid, which might have some dietary effects depending on what the mother's eating, and that will produce chemical changes in that brain. There will be auditory stimuli, mother's voice, etc., etc. And those are the very earliest experiences that are laid down. And then once you're born and other senses begin to develop, how you understand those sensory data input is by comparing them, this is my assertion, to your earliest memories, taste, sound, whatever it may be. So even though you have no experience of looking at a face, somehow you will relate that to whatever experiences you have in your brain. So, when you say a human can solve a problem without any prior experience, it's not true, all right? Because when I'm presented with a problem, I have all these years of experience of solving, inferring, collecting data, making irrational thoughts, etc. Why can't a machine do that?
But I'm
Because
seeing something.
It has all the data, right?
Yeah, I'm saying something different, Ian. So yeah, I completely agree with you. What I'm saying, at the highest level, is that a human is not necessarily intelligent unless he or she can solve a new problem. So let me explain what I mean by that. So the progression we have, right from inception, and all the experience that we go through, it's truly machine learning. It's the same process that we apply today. We say, we have a million pictures of dogs, a million pictures of cats. If we show those pictures to a deep neural network, over time, that network is able to say which one is a dog and which one is a cat. And I wouldn't call that intelligence. And so I'm just debating with you on this. So, if you say that humans learn like that, we take our experiences, we take data, we look at when things work and when things don't work. So reinforcement learning in AI jargon. So there is, constant machine learning, reinforcement learning happening in the human brain. We can pretty much replicate that now in a machine. But I wouldn't call the machine intelligent in that sense. And so, this may not be the right example. So when Einstein put the general relativity together, there wasn't a lot of previous experiences he could use to come up with that, right? It was sort of emerging in his own brain. It is not analogous to machine learning. It's not empiricism. It's not, training. It's not education. None of these actually, education, training, all of that is very analogous to machine learning as we think about in artificial intelligence. For me, intelligence, the term intelligence is something very special. which is you are able to take something that you have no idea about and create something. So in that sense, Ian, I'd like to get your perspective on this. Art, literature, music, areas like that, people who are doing those types of things, I would argue, show intelligence, whereas engineers, doctors, scientists are not really showing intelligence. They're showing education, training, perspectives, experiences, just like a machine would do.
Yeah. So I think if one looks at art, for example, let's just say pictorial art, uh, regardless of one's cultural and aesthetic preferences and biases, most people can recognize um, uh, an iconic artist, someone who paints in a manner or a style or a subject that has never been seen before. 99% of artists are slight modifications on other artists. It's all been done before, and people
Right.
always say that about writing. There are three basic stories, and they've been written about 25 million times, and it's just the
Right.
particular juxtaposition of language or cultural insight or what have you. But very few things are equivalent to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland or Joyce's Ulysses or Shakespeare's plays that are truly iconoclastic in that they are unprecedented, which is what I think you're really talking about. So I don't actually see much difference. And coming back to engineers, clearly, yes, there are engineers. With engineering, you're always building on what's gone before. But there are some which make a real qualitative change, which is not an increment or even a major change to something that already exists. Now, if that's a definition of intelligence, then yes, I agree. Well, I'm not. Yeah, I mean that's a long way for machines to get to that point. But if that's your definition of intelligence, then 99% of what humans do is not intelligent.
Yeah, so I take your point. Yeah, so I take the first point that it's not really the profession. So if my definition holds, it could hold pretty much in any profession. And the second idea that intelligence is really a step function, the ability to make a step function change in knowledge without using a lot of historical precedents. Because if you have historical stuff, we are showing machines are getting really
and much
good.
better than us, I suspect.
You show, and much better than us. Yeah. So this goes into sort of societal design question, which is we have all this 8.3 billion humans, and a large number of us are doing things that machines are actually a lot better at doing, right? And so you have to ask from if we were to ever get to, let's say, a level 1 society, I don't believe we have we have the chance to do that. But if we were, what will that look like? I don't think humans should be deployed in repetitive or any activity that machines could easily replicate. And it has to be really about how do you change things is really the question for humans.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way of thinking about this, and maybe COVID will accelerate this, but everyone has been talking for a long time about the observation that an enormous amount of human activity, as you already say, can be much better done by machine. And we're seeing whole industries starting to disappear. Retail stores are disappearing. Most manufacturing is now done by automation, et cetera, et cetera. So what that does is it has a huge impact on society. And I think the most likely one that needs to come about is a decrease in population size. But what there also needs to be, I think, if we're going to have people not rioting in the street because they're not felt to be of value is somehow to channel all that latent energy and potential creativity into doing the kinds of things that you're talking about. Now, whether that will ever come to pass is an interesting question. Are some things not being realized because we're just engaged? Even really quite bright people are engaged in pretty mundane activities on a day-to-day basis. So if they were relieved of that, paid a living wage, and were then free to pursue whatever took their fancy, would we see, huge leaps in creativity?
Yeah, I think some Scandinavian countries are already on that path, right? So there is an economic policy question here, which is, so universal minimum income, which is, if you look at it from a traditional economic viewpoint, seems, not a good policy, but universal minimum income is probably the only policy that will allow us to incrementally move away from the situation that we are in, which is deploying humans in activities that machines could do a lot better. And if that hypothesis is true, and we have sufficient amount of data already that is most likely true, we're going to see a huge jump in productivity and a huge jump in economic, the aggregate economics that we could generate from the whole system, which would mean that you can actually take 7-8 billion people and say, do what you want to do, what you would like to do, and really free them from the shackles of what they're currently doing, which machines are infinitely better at doing, right?
This is a very interesting question because a lot of people have argued over the centuries about how important work is to the human psyche and a need to be felt to be valued and valuable. And a lot of people engage in work which is not highly remunerative, but they feel that they are being valued and useful. If we take that away and don't recognize it, what will that do to the human psyche? Is it a learned behavior that we've acquired, or is it somehow innate? If it's innate, then it has to be satisfied in some way. And I'm not sure that would be satisfied. I mean, one sees it with retired people and all kinds of people who are made redundant when they are not, quote, needed by society, even though they may be financially secure. They go into depression, they sit around, they watch television. They're not out there coming up with new recipes or new theories or grand unification theories, I'm not so sure that would happen. But it is a very serious problem. I think I'm interested in the economic aspect, and maybe you can speak to this, because clearly, if I have a factory and I can run a machine, say 24 and not, I'm not going to hire people. I mean, it's just an economic drive. So as long as we still have a capitalist-based society, I think we're going to see this happen, and we're already seeing it happen in the Midwest, and that's already produced enormous political and economic consequences for the country because of disaffection amongst those voters. So we really have to address that in some way, and I'm not sure the minimum wage or living wage, whatever one calls it, and letting people do what they want is going to solve the problem.
Yeah. So I think, if you abstract the problem, I would argue that we consider work to be a good, but I would argue work is bad, is a bad. So it is a stand-in today for all the things that you say, feeling valuable, nourishing the human psyche, because we don't have
Right.
anything else to stand
Right.
in for
Right.
that. But it's a bad thing, because humans are not really created to do work. We create machines to do
Yeah.
work. And because we didn't have a system that allows us to do that, humans are doing that,
Right.
right? So my view is that if we are able to do that, I think the transition, as you say, is going to be really rough, for our generation and perhaps the generation behind us. The transition is going to be really rough in the sense that, so for example, the physics books that I used in the university are the same physics books that my daughter used 35
Yeah.
years later. Same book, different edition. And you have to wonder. So for example, Newtonian mechanics, right? Solving all those problems, acceleration, ball, moving
Yeah.
down the slope and all of that are interesting things, but we don't need those things anymore, right? Machines are so much better at engineering designs. They can do all the stuff that engineers do today. And so we have to be able to redesign it, bottom up from education. So I think it was Denmark, no, sorry, Norway, who has sort of redesigned their education system, basically saying there are no requirements anymore. In sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, they're not asking students to go study physics, chemistry, biology, but rather asking the students to design their curriculum, sort of a personal design of education. So we need to do some dramatic things bottom up for this transition to work. But I think in the middle, a lot of people are going to get caught in two different worlds, I think. And that's where the problem
Yes,
is.
I'm sure that's true, and we're already there. I mean, we're clearly already there, and
Yeah.
I yeah, I just think it's going to have to be a natural evolutionary process. What concerns me is whether when people become so afraid and so illiterate in science,
Right.
that there will be such a swing towards whether it's a revolutionary or emotional based political action that we could regress. Because all this machine productivity and learning and everything does require a relatively peaceful, functioning society capable of generating power, etc., etc., etc. Yeah. Well,
Right.
anyway, I'm not sure where we're going with this, other than to be fairly depressed.
Yeah. I mean, the other complication here also is that, so today, a quarter of the population, I know it's in the US, I don't know what the world numbers are. Nearly 25% of the population believe the sun is going around
Yes,
the earth.
right.
And so if we are moving into a position that says, a lot of the prescriptive sciences, engineering, medicine, all of those could be done by machines, and we are moving humans to, sort of a different way of thinking. And science maybe takes a backseat. Science, the way that we
Right.
define it, takes a backseat. That probably has implications, more, broader implications in terms of what we are trying to accomplish, I guess,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that I think is particularly germane to this point, which I have both experienced personally and also from talking to my physician friends, is of course telemedicine. And
Yeah.
so a number of things are happening there, which I think is relevant to this whole conversation. You're probably aware of this. But first of all, a lot of the people in waiting rooms are there not because they really need any medical help. It's more of a social, psychological help,
Mm,
right? And
mm,
so the first thing that my friends see is a decrease in the number of people that are requesting telemedicine consults.
Interesting.
Secondly, the type of things that they talk about on the telemedicine consult are not the type of things they typically talk about in the office. They tend to be much better defined, what you might call a real problem, right? And then
Yeah.
you're getting now, interestingly, as people become comfortable with, okay, the FaceTime is pretty close, apart from a lot of, well, it's pretty close to actually being in the doctor's office, but a telephone conference on your health
Mm,
is quite a way away from that, and is not very far away
mm,
from a machine, right? And I think
right.
there are data already that most machines are better at most of the diagnostic problems that typically walk into a GP's office. So I think
Right.
we are going to see a greater transference of trust and confidence into machines. I'd rather deal with machines most of the time, to be honest with you, because they're fairly
Mhm.
logical, you know, um,
Yeah.
and they're timely and they work 7/24. And so there may be a psychological change in the population. Now, I think, as you were suggesting, if our scientific knowledge begins to erode and we no longer use that knowledge to inform our actions and our decisions, what will that do? What will we become? Interesting questions. Right.
Yeah. And this goes back to, kind of that evolutionary question. So if this were to come to pass as we are defining it, one would imagine the selection pressures would change the human of the future, right? Um, the successful humans of the future could be quite different from
Oh,
the
yes,
humans
absolutely.
today,
Yes.
right? So, I mean, think about the pharma R&D placebo
Yeah.
problem. Every drug that comes to market has close to 60%, close to 40% placebo
Right.
effect in it, and so humans are really a very inefficient processor, I would say, of data, and that's because they have feelings, they have emotions, they have all this fluffy stuff that is not really related to data. And in financial markets, for example, you can demonstrably show that machines are a lot better at trading than humans sitting in front of a computer, and trying
Yes.
to trade,
Sure.
right? Um, and so are we then saying that the future human, the ones who are going to survive and become successful, will have traits and characteristics quite different from what we currently see?
I suspect that's the case, but the key word you just said was useful. Um, how would in what context is that? I'm more tempted to use an equally vague word, and that is happy, or
Right.
content. Perhaps content is the adjective we need to use to achieve some sort of stability. So, what
Mm.
will a human in, whether it's 100 or maybe even only 20 years' time, need to, quote, look like or behave like in order to be content in a society where 90% of what currently involves humans is taken over by machines? What will our relationship with those machines look like, and with each other? And what will we be engaged in doing? And what qualities would we need in order to be
Hmm.
content or happy or whatever?
Right.
I think utility is a difficult question there, a difficult word. I'm not sure what
Yeah.
that means.
Yeah. I mean, uh, it might be that, and this is just a speculation, that we don't really have a very well defined objective function, and it is different for different people. And so if you sit an individual down and ask, if there are no constraints, how do you maximize, let's call it utility, happiness, whatever you have, whatever that is, what are the factors in there? I suspect most people cannot really say what it is, right? So it's almost like we are running around trying to get somewhere, but without really defining what that destination really is. And that is a complication that I think most of us
Oh,
have.
for sure. And I think most of that becomes a less pressing question when most people are worried about eating and sheltering and paying the rent and being safe. I
Yes,
think safety is also obviously it's sort of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Once you've satisfied all those things around shelter, food, protection, safety, then you get into what we were discussing earlier. And I think that's feeling of fulfillment, of feeling valued. Now, whether, as we already discussed, that need to feel valued is an artifact of a work capitalist society. Whether it's something intrinsic in our nature, I don't know. Um,
right.
but ultimately, Gil, one shouldn't lose sight of the demonstrable fact that it's really our genes which are controlling our destiny, and our genes want nothing
Yeah,
more than to be duplicated. So
right,
somehow, somewhere, whether it's the drive to acquire the wherewithal and the technology to catapult our genes into the universe so that when the sun explodes we don't all disappear. I suppose ultimately
right.
that's really going to become a driver. um, if
Yeah,
you believe in the selfish gene, I mean, I think we started this whole conversation around bacteria and how they can exhibit what we might think is intelligent behavior, but it's really driven by gene reproduction behavior. And if that's
right.
ultimately our goal, then we know for a fact, what is it, 3 billion years, whatever, the sun's going to explode into a red.
I think we have
five
close to
billion years.
5
Okay, so
billion, though.
we got a little time,
Yeah,
but but ultimately, I suppose that would be an interesting question to ask, is the prototypical asteroid question. So there's an asteroid coming; it's too big to blow up with nuclear warheads. It's going to hit us in 400 years or whatever. What are we going to do? And I
yeah.
suspect a lot of that would involve getting to Mars or getting cells into systems that could be sent to Andromeda, or with the hope of speciation after that.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe that gives us, a way to think about definitions of intelligence and consciousness too. So perhaps intelligence is an ability to change the programmatic aspects of an organism. So if you say, food, sex, that's about it, food and sex are the only factors in the objective function that is programmatic. Maybe intelligence is an organism changing that, right?
Overriding it, you mean?
Overriding it, yeah, overriding it, or fundamentally changing that
Why would it
objective
do that?
function. So, um, so if you so there's this idea of level 0, level 1, level 2 societies, right, where you reach a level of consciousness that is not individual but really
Yeah,
societal consciousness, um, in which case, your objective functions are quite different. The 8.3 billion people that we have today, the difference in their genome structures, as you know, is
right.
minute. And if you buy that, if you believe that, then you already have enough data. You don't have the consciousness aspects of it, but you have enough data to potentially reprogram your own mind, right? To say, that idea is outdated. But but I don't know. I think uh, I, for me it is sort of a step function change. Either we get there or we don't, right? If we don't get there, we're going to tread along the way that we currently are, and that objective function will continue to be the
Yeah,
same.
yeah. Hmm. I know.
It's
I'm sort of intrigued by your whole concept of stepping outside and changing it. And as I said earlier, and I perhaps this is a very mundane way of thinking about it, but I wonder where the impetus, where the drive will come from to make that
yeah,
change, if it's not one of the fundamental drives, like gene, like, well, I say gene duplication. I mean, that's really what it's about. I mean, it's not even
Right.
organism thinking about a human per se. It's somehow the genes
Yeah.
that drive us to reproduce. And if yeah, I think what is likely to happen
Mm-hmm.
is it will be something along those lines. It will be something around that successful reproduction that will bring about change. I
Yeah. But what if we have technologies here? And what if you have technologies that guarantees you that reproduction? So, this idea that an individual is, or the system's objective function is duplication, reproduction of the genes. Suppose we introduce technology that guarantees with no failure
yeah
that's going to happen. Then could you abstract the human
yeah
from that
yeah.
process?
Well, yes. Well,
So,
that whatever's doing the guaranteeing, right,
yeah,
would probably be of human origin.
but it could be a machine origin
Why would a
too.
machine do that? Because it would be an intelligent. That would be coming back to our earlier this point. That would be an
Yeah,
intelligent decision by the machine to say, okay, well, maybe this is it. If a machine does gain intelligence, as we've been discussing, then
right,
one of the ways it's going to calm the human population down and stop them from pulling the plug is to guarantee their reproductive success. So it comes up
right.
with whatever that may look like, and then everyone calms
Yeah,
down.
yeah. So I guess that's an optimistic note.
We should stop there before we get any deeper into that.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, this has been excellent, Ian. I think we should do
Yes,
it more
it's been
often.
great fun, Gil. I've enjoyed it very much, and yeah, let's plan on that.
Excellent. Yeah,
Okay, you're
thanks so
welcome.
much,
Bye
Ian.
bye.
Okay.